The courtroom held its breath. A 17-year-old girl stood at the defendant's stand, calmly questioning the prosecutor, leaving both the judge and jury stunned. She had no lawyer by her side. No one defended her. Everyone was against her. Yet with just one question, she made a case that once seemed airtight began to unravel. Then came a video. A hidden statement quietly surfaced. And those who had laughed at her, fell silent, heads lowered. Who is she? And how did a young black girl, who appeared to have no chance at all, make the entire justice system pause and look at itself? This isn't like any courtroom story you've ever seen. And you won't be able to look away before the final minute. Fulton County Courthouse, Atlanta. That morning's atmosphere was thick, as if an invisible hand weighed down every row of benches, every breath, every piercing gaze from those seated in the courtroom. The early wind drifted through the cold hallway, but inside, the packed courtroom felt stifling, choking with tension and heat. Every seat was filled. At the back, local news cameras had been set up, lenses sweeping back and forth as if hunting for the perfect golden moment. They weren't about to miss what the media had dubbed the boldest car theft of the month. At the center of all attention stood Ariana Brooks, a 17-year-old black girl, silently facing the judge. Her face was remarkably calm, no tears, no glances for help. She stood there in a slightly oversized silver gray coat, hands in her pockets, eyes fixed straight ahead toward the bench. Anyone observing closely might notice her hands slightly clenched inside the coat pocket, a small, almost invisible sign that she wasn't entirely numb to what was happening around her. Ariana was being charged with stealing a BMW X6 belonging to Franklin Reeds, a wealthy and well-known investor in Atlanta's financial scene. It wasn't just a luxury car, it was a symbol of power and influence. The fact that a young girl from the city's south side was accused of stealing from a powerful white man had ignited public outrage. This was no longer a typical criminal case, it had become a public trial of status, race, and prejudice. From the bench, Judge Robert Halbridge peered at Ariana through his silver-rimmed glasses. He didn't need to speak. His cold stare and condescending look said everything. Known for his tough stance, especially against the youth he often called rude and uneducated, Halbridge had made it clear over the years, kids today think they can out-talk the law, but here, they'll learn a real lesson. And today, he carried that very mindset into the courtroom. His gaze lingered on Ariana longer than necessary. There was no impartiality in his expression, only challenge, perhaps even mockery. He didn't see her as a defendant worthy of a fair trial. He saw her as a living example of every prejudice he believed in, rebellious, ungrateful, dangerous. Still, Ariana said nothing. No protest. No expression. Her silence unnerved the room. A few spectators started to murmur. The shuffle of chairs, the clicks of cameras, quiet whispers filled the air. Her court-appointed attorney, Margot Vance, sat beside her, clearly uncomfortable. She wasn't built for high-profile cases. Her shirt collar was wrinkled, the file in front of her a mess. She kept flipping pages, avoiding eye contact with the judge. Margot glanced at Ariana. She looked like she wanted to say something, maybe reassurance, maybe a warning, but thought better of it. Her hand tapped the desk lightly, fingers out of sync with any rhythm, reflecting her own unease in the room thick with pressure. Then came the first laugh. Soft, but loud enough to spark others. A woman in the back row sneered, trying to act tough. Let's see how long she lasts. A young reporter whispered, better get a shot of her face when the verdict comes in. It'll sell. The laughter spread like thin smoke, taunting, dismissive. It was as if they had all already decided her fate. No need for a trial. No need for evidence. A girl like Ariana, standing there, with her skin color, her age, that was enough for them to render judgment in their minds. And this was only the beginning. The courtroom grew strangely quiet as Prosecutor Derek Sloan stood up. He adjusted his collar and walked to the center of the floor with slow, deliberate steps. Each footstep echoed steadily on the cold stone floor, affirming the confidence and authority he carried. He didn't need to open a folder. No need to scan any documents. To him, this wasn't a battle of wits, it was a simple performance. A formality. Sloan stood tall, his voice firm, clear, and without hesitation or theatrics. He began with a statement that cut straight to the point. On the evening of the 12th, the defendant, Ariana Brooks, was arrested while sitting behind the wheel of a BMW X6, reported stolen just 2 hours earlier. He paused for a second, turned toward Judge Halbridge, then glanced quickly at the jury. His eyes seemed to say, that alone is enough. But he didn't stop there. Sloan emphasized the key pieces of evidence. He held up a file, raising it just high enough for everyone to see. "We have fingerprint analysis," he said. "Found on the steering wheel, the driver's door, and the gear shift." "Whose prints?" "Ariana Brooks." He took a few steps to the right, then opened an enlarged image taken from a security camera. Footage from intersections 3 and 5 shows this vehicle speeding, pursued by 2 police cruisers. He turned back, and this time, his gaze was sharp as a blade. "And as you've heard, this vehicle was later abandoned by the side of the road, and the defendant was found not far from the scene, out of breath, showing signs of fleeing." He looked at Ariana for the first time since entering the courtroom. Not to convince her, but to show her there was no way out. He concluded, his voice clipped and final, "There is no doubt. Ariana Brooks committed this theft." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration. A knife driven in, with no intention of being pulled back. On the bench, Judge Halbridge gave a slight nod. His eyes met Sloane's with visible approval, like a teacher pleased with his top student's presentation. The nod was subtle but weighty, as if he were closing the lid on a box labeled "Easy Verdict." Silent approval rippled outward. From the gallery, whispers began to stir. A middle-aged man leaned in and muttered, "This girl's done for." A woman scoffed, "Stupid move, stealing from Reed's. What was she thinking?" A young reporter tapped quickly on his phone, "Caught red-handed. Evidence rock solid." But amid the murmurs, the smirks, and the assured nods, Ariana Brooks remained still. No frown. No tears. No visible emotion. Her hands stayed in her coat pockets, her gaze steady and fixed straight ahead. Her face was like a still lake, undisturbed by even the slightest ripple. And to some, that silence started to feel unsettling. Judge Halbridge tilted his head slightly, studying her. He wasn't smiling anymore, but the condescension in his eyes hadn't faded. He muttered just loud enough for the room to hear, "Let's hope she still remembers her name when she leaves this place." A few laughs escaped from the crowd. Quiet, but sharp and cold. "And Ariana?" She blinked. Just once. No one in the room knew that in that very moment, the real game had just begun. After the prosecutor's impassioned accusation, Judge Halbridge leaned slightly forward, his eyes moving toward the defense table. He tapped his fingers lightly on the wooden surface, a familiar gesture that signaled the impatience beginning to creep into his voice. "Ms. Vance, it's your turn." Margot Vance flinched slightly. She pushed her chair back, stood up, still holding an unopened file in her hand. Her face looked slightly flustered. Her voice was so low that the judge had to raise an eyebrow to catch it. "Your Honor, I'd like to present that my client." Before she could finish the sentence, she felt a movement beside her. Ariana gently touched Margot's wrist. It wasn't forceful, not hurried, but just enough to make the older woman stop. Margot turned to look. The eyes of the 17-year-old girl didn't tremble. Her gaze was calm, steady, as if everything was unfolding just as she intended. I will represent myself, Your Honor, Ariana said, her voice not loud but crystal clear. No signs of panic, no hesitation. Each word came out in a low, steady tone, sharp and composed. The entire room fell silent. The whispers vanished. Curious eyes began to turn toward her. People weren't used to seeing a teenage girl, not yet of legal age, stand in the middle of a courtroom, where every word spoken could be used against her, and declare she would defend herself. On the bench, Halbridge paused for a second. Then he let out a dismissive chuckle. It wasn't entirely mockery, but a blend of surprise and contempt. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded. You're joking, he asked, emphasizing the final word, as if to make sure she understood her statement wasn't to be taken seriously. Ariana didn't avert her gaze. She repeated, this time slower, I'm absolutely serious. A simple sentence, but the calmness in her voice stirred a ripple through the courtroom. The jury glanced at one another. A few furrowed their brows. Others remained silent, just watching. Derek Sloan, sitting on the opposite side, let out a loud laugh, clearly mocking. Great, he said, turning to the judge, that'll make this quicker. She has no idea what she's getting herself into. He leaned back, arms crossed. In his eyes, the trial had shifted from a formality to entertainment. Margot Vance didn't move. She looked at Ariana a moment longer. Something shifted in her expression, as if quietly accepting what was about to unfold. She gave a slight nod, said nothing, then sat down, withdrawing her hands from the file and leaving everything in front of Ariana. A simple retreat, but one that carried a surprising amount of trust. Ariana stepped forward slowly. Her shoulders didn't shrink. Her steps weren't rushed. She stood upright, her eyes locked on the jury. It wasn't a pleading look, nor a defiant one. It was the gaze of someone who knew exactly what she was about to say. And from that moment on, no one in the courtroom saw her as just a girl waiting for her verdict anymore. The courtroom grew unusually quiet as Ariana stepped one pace forward. She wasn't in a rush, didn't appear nervous. Her eyes swept calmly across the room before settling on Prosecutor Sloan. Her composure stood in stark contrast to the rising heat in the atmosphere. Mr. Prosecutor, Ariana spoke clearly, who claimed to have seen me behind the wheel of the BMW X6? The question sounded simple, but it made Sloan pause for a beat. He squinted at her, then quickly replied, his voice still confident, Officer Hartley. The report is very clear. He stated he saw you during the pursuit. Ariana gave a slight nod, as if making a mental note. She didn't object immediately. Instead, she looked up at Judge Halbridge and spoke slowly, I request a review of Officer Hartley's duty GPS log from that evening, to confirm whether he was actually present at the scene. A few quiet sounds stirred in the courtroom, the rustle of paper, a light cough. Someone leaned forward, as if they had just heard something more intriguing than expected. Halbridge leaned slightly, his fingers tapping the bench. There was hesitation in his eyes, clearly visible. He looked to Sloan, waiting for a reaction, then turned back to Ariana, you want to check a police officer's GPS? Based on a personal hunch. Ariana didn't take back her request. She met his gaze directly, I have no hunch, I just want confirmation. If he was there, the data will show it. If he wasn't, then what? The silence following that question lasted longer than expected. Sloan began to show signs of impatience. He adjusted his jacket and said quickly, Your Honor, we cannot allow a defendant to steer the proceedings based on baseless demands. His voice no longer carried the certainty it had earlier. Each word came out faster, with less clarity. Halbridge raised an eyebrow and turned back to the prosecutor, but this time he didn't nod. He neither objected nor endorsed the request. He looked at Ariana, then lowered his eyes to the bench, as if working through something deeper. Ariana remained standing, firm and steady. She didn't push the situation further. She let the silence linger, as if giving everyone the space to hear the growing doubt inside their own minds. Whispers began to rise again in the room. A man in the back row murmured, "Why be afraid of checking the GPS, if he was really there?" A woman frowned, leaning toward her colleague, "Something's off about this." On the jury bench, two members exchanged a look. One nodded slightly, the other glanced down at the case file and flipped back to the first page. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Halbridge wasn't smiling. His face loosened, his eyes lowered. He rested his elbows on the bench, fingertips pressing to his forehead, as though a headache had crept in right through what was supposed to be an open and shut case. And that, right there, was the first crack. After several seconds of heavy silence, Prosecutor Sloan adjusted his stance. He exhaled lightly, then stepped to the center of the courtroom, this time raising his voice slightly, as if trying to reclaim control. "We still have physical evidence, Your Honor," he said, emphasizing each word. "The defendant's fingerprints were clearly found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Undeniable evidence." He held up a file, flipped open a page, and turned toward the jury. "Fingerprints don't lie," he declared. "No one forced her to touch the wheel. She did that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the most important truth." Ariana didn't react right away. She waited for his accusation to echo fully through the courtroom, waited until silence returned. Then she nodded. A slow nod, as if she were confirming part of the truth that everyone had assumed was the whole. "Yes," she said clearly, "my fingerprints were there." The room froze. A few people thought she had just confessed. But then she continued, her tone steady, though her eyes now held a sharper edge. "The car was parked outside Avalon Bookstore," she explained. "I had just left with two friends after buying a few novels. As we passed by, I noticed the door was unlocked. I was curious. I opened it, looked inside, and then I closed it. That's all." She paused for a second, glanced at the jury, then asked, "Does touching the steering wheel mean I stole the car?" Her question rang out clearly in the courtroom, now falling into silence. An older man in the back row tilted his head. A middle-aged woman frowned, lips pressed tight. And in the front row of the jury, someone began to nod. Not quickly, not strongly, but enough to show the first signs of reconsideration. Ariana didn't let the quiet linger. "The police found the car abandoned in the western neighborhood," she continued. "I was arrested while walking home with my friends, 5 blocks away. Not in the car. Not fleeing. Just walking home." Sloan shifted slightly, tapping his pen against the edge of his file. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But Ariana was already turning her focus. She looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, I request to confront the forensic analyst who examined the fingerprints in this case. I have the right to ask about the procedure, the accuracy, the chain of custody." That request wasn't just a legal move. It was a direct strike at the very foundation of the prosecution's argument. Halbridge sat up straight. He turned toward Sloan. The interest in his face had visibly faded. Sloan bit his lip, then slowly exhaled. He nodded, reluctantly. "That individual is not present in court," he admitted. His voice grew a little hoarse. "They were not subpoenaed." No one in the courtroom spoke. But this silence was no longer indifference. It was the sound of doubt swelling quietly in every heart. The courtroom fell silent. Not because the questions had stopped, but because everyone was waiting to see what Ariana would say next. She didn't take long. Her voice rose, low and firm. "So I'm being charged based on the conclusion of someone, who isn't even here today. Someone I have no right to confront. Someone whose testimony can't be verified." The atmosphere seemed to slow. Her question wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, yet it struck directly at the foundation the entire trial was built upon. The jury straightened in their seats. A few leaned forward, glancing at the prosecutor. In the back, several reporters placed their fingers on their keyboards, but no one dared to type a word. Judge Halbridge narrowed his eyes at Ariana. He exhaled sharply through his nose, then spoke in a low voice that was still audible, "You're going too far." A warning. A reminder of who was in control of the courtroom. But Ariana didn't back down. She looked at him directly, her eyes not hard, but unmistakably clear, "Or maybe I'm going exactly where I need to." There was no reply. Only a subtle shift in Halbridge's gaze, his eyes dipping slightly. No one would call it agreement, but it certainly wasn't denial anymore. Ariana didn't let the silence linger. She opened her case file, pulled out a small USB drive, and handed it to a court officer. "I have new material. Footage from the security camera at Seabrook gas station, where the car was reported stolen." The courtroom stirred. Sloan looked up, his eyes freezing momentarily. Camera shutters clicked to life. In moments, all attention turned toward the large screen being prepared for display. Ariana didn't look at the screen. She stayed focused on the jury. "In that footage," she said slowly, "the person driving the car is a young white male." The words cut through the silence like a blade. Sloan jumped from his seat before the judge could speak. "Objection," he said loudly, his voice tight, "the identity in that video cannot be confirmed. The footage is blurry, lighting is poor, it's not admissible as reliable evidence." Ariana didn't rush. She turned to look at him, her eyes didn't challenge him, but asked a quiet, unspoken question, "What are you afraid of?" She didn't need to say it. Her expression said it all. "Maybe you're right," she said, "maybe the identity isn't clear. But at the very least, I don't look like the person in that video." Now, the courtroom entered a silence more profound than ever. No one laughed. No one spoke. A juror placed their pen down, eyes fixed on Ariana. A woman in the gallery raised her hand to her mouth. Sloan remained standing, but said nothing more. Judge Halbridge rested his chin in his hand. He stared at the screen, paused on the image of a young man opening the BMW's door. The footage was blurry, but one thing was undeniably clear: it wasn't Ariana. No one needed to say it. Because by now, everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. And no one dared to breathe too loudly. The courtroom hadn't yet settled from the impact of the video footage when Ariana took another step forward. She didn't raise her voice or make any dramatic gesture. She simply reached into her folder and slowly pulled out a single sheet of paper, carefully wrapped in a plastic sleeve. Every movement was calm, yet it made the entire room feel like it had stopped breathing. "Your Honor," she said, her eyes fixed on Judge Halbridge, "I'd like to submit my final piece of evidence, the original statement from the vehicle's owner, Mr. Carter Miles." A ripple of murmurs instantly rose. Sloan looked up, slightly stunned. His face shifted color, though he tried to maintain composure. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the jury seemed to snap out of their defensive posture. Ariana took a breath, then read each word slowly. "I saw a white male jump into the car and drive away." The sentence, as it left her lips, wasn't just words on a page. It was a blade cutting straight through the structure of the entire trial. Sloan jumped to his feet, his voice sharp. "We were not informed of this statement." He stressed the word "not," as if trying to erase the legitimacy of the document in her hands. But Ariana didn't back down. Her gaze held steady, cold in its calm. "It's in the original file," she replied simply, "submitted along with the police report, right after the incident." "How did you miss it?" A chill ran through many in the room. A few heads dropped. Some eyes darted across to others. No one was laughing anymore. No one dared to mock her. Judge Halbridge furrowed his brow. He straightened his back, sitting higher on the bench. His gaze shifted between Ariana and the prosecutor, then stopped at the clerk's desk. "Bring that document to me," he ordered. A court officer immediately stepped forward to retrieve the statement. Each step echoed loudly in the overly quiet courtroom. When the document reached Halbridge, he didn't read it immediately. He placed it on the desk, removed his glasses, cleaned them with the edge of his robe, then finally picked up the page. The seconds passed with weight. No one moved. Sloane remained standing, hands clenched. Below, a few reporters scribbled quickly into their notepads. A woman clutched her husband's arm tightly, eyes locked on the judge. Halbridge flipped through the document, his eyes scanning each line slowly. His face showed no emotion, but the change in his gaze couldn't be hidden. At the final line, he looked up, first at Ariana, then at Sloane. He nodded once, and his voice dropped low, "Verified." Those two words cracked the silence like thunder in a hidden storm. The courtroom erupted. Someone gasped audibly. A chair screeched across the floor. The whispers turned into a wave of stunned voices. Someone tilted their head back and exhaled sharply. Another clamped a hand over their mouth. An older man in the back said aloud, "What the hell just happened?" Reporters rushed outside to make calls, record footage, and send updates. Cameras, phones, and pens all flew into action as if this was no longer just a trial, but a breaking news event. And amidst all that chaos, only Ariana remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't tear up. She just stood there, composed, as if she had always known the truth would come. And today, finally, it had arrived. The courtroom had not yet calmed down after the shock of the final statement. The whispers hadn't faded, the eyes hadn't moved away from Ariana, when Judge Halbridge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. The disdain was gone. So was the smirk from earlier. What remained was a look full of curiosity, mixed with a hint of confusion that he could no longer hide. He furrowed his brow, his voice low and low, as if trying to make sense of the entire trial all over again. "Who are you, really?" Ariana didn't blink. She didn't need time to think. The answer seemed like something long prepared, not to boast, but to arrive at just the right moment. She replied softly, almost just loud enough to be heard, "First-year law student, full scholarship, Emory University." The entire courtroom froze. Sloane stood motionless. A few people turned to each other. But Ariana didn't stop. "I've been studying law since I was 12, she continued, her voice steady and calm. "My mother, Ms. Celeste Brooks, is the legal advisor for the city of Atlanta." There was no need to add anything else. The name alone was enough. A scratching sound of a pen racing across paper echoed urgently. A reporter in the back row jerked his head up, eyes wide. He quickly looked down and scribbled so fast his hand trembled. A few others in the room recognized the name, heads started to turn, eyes whispered quietly to one another. Halbridge remained still, but the neutrality in his expression was gone. He sat in silence, as if frozen by what he'd just heard. The question "Who are you?" was no longer about identity. It had become a question about capability, strength, and a truth he had nearly overlooked. Sloane still said nothing. He didn't bow his head, didn't leave. He just stood there, arms limp at his sides, eyes lost in a courtroom that, an hour ago, he had completely controlled. Ariana turned back toward the jury. This time, she didn't stand as a defendant. There was no more hesitation, no need for permission. She held her head high, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. "This," she said, her voice lower than usual but clear and weighted, "isn't just about me. This is about a system. A system that allows people to jump to conclusions. Based on assumptions. Based on skin color. Based on laziness, injustice." No one replied, but the response was clear. One by one, the jurors began nodding. Some nodded slowly, deeply. Others touched their files as if confirming they had truly seen too many gaps. From those who had once avoided her gaze, now came quiet attention and respect. Judge Halbridge bowed his head slightly, his hand reaching for the wooden gavel before him. No extra words. No explanations. No circling around. He brought the gavel down with a loud, firm, and decisive bang. All charges dismissed, he declared, case closed. And with that single strike, not only was an indictment erased, but it marked the first crack in a system long accustomed to running on flawed assumptions. The courtroom doors had barely swung closed when a wave of reporters surged forward. Microphones thrust toward Ariana's face, camera flashes firing non-stop. Questions came flying from every direction. Did you know from the start that you would win? How did it feel when the judge ruled in your favor? Are you planning to sue back? Their voices overlapped, crowded, frantic, as if each of them feared missing a moment too rare to ever happen again. Ariana didn't answer. She didn't even look at them. She walked straight ahead, decisive, as if no one else existed around her. At the bottom of the marble steps, her mother was waiting. Celeste Brooks said nothing. She just looked at her daughter. Her eyes were bright, glistening, but without tears. Inside them was an entire sky of pride, needing no words to explain. When Ariana reached her, Celeste opened her arms just slightly. They embraced. Not tight, not long, but enough to wash away all the bitterness swallowed during that trial. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Derek Sloan, who had once stood at the center of the room with almost arrogant confidence, was now being asked to hand over the full case file. A senior official entered, requesting a detailed review of each piece of evidence, every testimony that had been overlooked. Sloan's face went pale. He said nothing. His gaze drifted to the empty workspace before him. Inside, something was cracking. On the second floor of the building, Judge Halbridge stood behind tall glass. He looked down at the courtyard where Ariana had just exited. His eyes no longer carried coldness, no longer held authority. Only weight. A silence he used to impose on others now returned to him. The girl he had once dismissed. Once mocked. Once seen as a foregone conviction. Now, she had brought the entire system to a halt. No one dared to laugh at her anymore. The mocking chuckles from that morning had transformed into awkward, uneasy glances. One by one, people began leaving the courthouse, carrying with them an unfamiliar feeling, as if they had just witnessed something that defied every rule they knew. A young journalist, who had quietly taken notes throughout the trial, stood off to the side, watching Ariana's silhouette fade into the distance. He muttered softly, not really to anyone, "She's going to do something big." No one replied, but a few nearby nodded gently. Ariana didn't look back. She didn't need to say anything. She just smiled, barely, pulled up the hood of her coat, and disappeared into the crowd moving in the opposite direction. Among them, she looked small. But from that moment on, no one would ever see her as just another girl again. Because she hadn't just walked out of a courtroom. She had stepped into history. How many people have stood in court, not because they were guilty, but because someone decided what they looked like was enough? How many verdicts were shaped by first impressions, by skin color, by clothing, or by silence? Ariana Brooks was lucky. She had the knowledge to defend herself. She had the courage to speak up, to stand firm under the weight of suspicion. But not everyone gets that chance. Not everyone is heard before being judged. The justice system should not exist merely to close cases. It must exist to uncover the truth, to serve justice, not reinforce bias. One young girl proved that. And she did something thousands never dared to dream, she made the system stop and listen. But her journey is only just beginning. The road ahead is long. And she cannot walk it alone. What if next time, the person on trial is you? Or someone you love? Someone holding nothing but the truth, and no one willing to hear it? If this story made you pause, even for a second, if it made you think, then don't let it end here. Share this video. Let another Ariana Brooks out there know they're not alone. And if you believe in justice, in truth, in the power of stories, leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel, so we never miss the stories that deserve to be heard.